The common thread across all the left-wing viewpoints on ICE that you're seeing is that the left repeatedly does not consider or prioritize incentives and like policy needing to be structured around incentives and consequences and how that shapes people's behavior. Like with immigration policy in general, just enforcing our immigration laws, they think we should just abolish ICE. So they don't think about the second order effects of, okay, what would happen if we actually did that? What sort of incentive structure does that create? If we had no consequences for coming here illegally, then our country would immediately be flooded by millions more illegal immigrants. And they don't think about the second order effects of that or the third order effects of that. Whenever those millions of illegal immigrants got here, what would that cause? Well, we have a limited supply of housing, for one. So immediately it would drastically increase the demand for housing, which would drastically increase the price of housing, and it would drastically increase rents. It would drastically increase the price of groceries because you again have pretty limited supply of things. You have the same number of businesses here that are producing food, groceries, but suddenly you have this drastically increased demand. So that would drastically increase the price of groceries as well. That's a third order effect. So like second order effect of no immigration policy, abolish ICE, whatever, would be that we would get flooded by millions of illegal immigrants. The third order effect would be that the price of things would go up because the demand curve drastically expanded. Now that you have millions more people here, you have millions more people to house, millions more mouths to feed. And so they repeatedly do not think about incentive structures and how that shapes behavior and how those behaviors have second order, third order effects on our society. And you see this also with how they've responded to ICE's kind of response to these belligerent citizens who are violently, oftentimes, resisting, impeding, agitating, interfering with law enforcement, the enforcement of federal laws that the people voted for. This is not a tyrannical regime. They are not enforcing laws against the consent of the governed. These are laws that people voted for. People voted for Donald Trump after Donald Trump ran a campaign on strong immigration enforcement. So when people see ICE fighting with these protesters who are being belligerent, and I'm not saying that's every case, but whenever people are being violent and forceful and intentionally intimidating, harassing, agitating federal law enforcement officers, there have to be consequences for that, or else people will just do it en masse. There have to be consequences for coming here illegally, and there have to be consequences for violently and belligerently resisting the enforcement of federal laws that the American people voted for. There have to be consequences to disincentivize these things, or else people will do them in far greater numbers. And I know some leftists might fantasize about that sort of thing because they only think of that second order effect, like, okay, well then we could just protest as violently as we want. Well, what happens then? Then law and order just becomes a nothing burger. Like you don't have any enforcement whenever someone decides to attack a law enforcement officer. So why enforce any laws if you know that you can be attacked and that's just going to be allowed? That cannot be allowed. There have to be negative, unpleasant consequences for doing that, just like there have to be negative, unpleasant consequences for coming to this country illegally. Like people want deportation to be this easy, pleasant thing. And I do think that we need to treat undocumented immigrants with dignity, but at the same time, deportation cannot be this pleasant, easy thing, because if it were, then that doesn't create an incentive structure that discourages you from coming here illegally. If the absolute worst thing that can happen to you if you come here illegally is a very pleasant, quiet deportation where you're quietly and discreetly told that you need to go to your home country, they'll buy you a plane ticket, they'll give you time to arrange for work in your home country, they'll give you some money for just like different various travel expenses. If that's what it were like, which is what the left would want, then everybody would try their luck and come here illegally anyway. So like if it were still illegal to come here undocumented, but we had soft consequences for doing that, people would still flood our country illegally because the worst thing that could happen really wouldn't be that bad. So people would try their luck. Again, it's about thinking of incentive structures. What sort of behavior does this encourage or discourage? And what are the first order, second order, third order effects of that policy, with the behavior that it encourages or discourages, or the absence of policy? If you don't have kind of any consequences of doing something, what does that create? It's about incentives. And the third thing that I think, so you've got just coming here illegally, that's the first thing people aren't considering incentives on. And then you've got people violently resisting law enforcement and agitating law enforcement officers. These are the first two things that I think people are just not considering the incentive structures here. But the third thing that I would say that people just aren't thinking through fully is the standards that we hold these ICE officers to. Like, I agree there should be an investigation into any time a civilian gets shot and killed by an ICE officer. I think there should obviously be an investigation, but people are holding them to these impossible standards. They're saying, well, didn't you see in that split second where they take the gun away while there are multiple people crossing bodies, covering each other, where there's probably a lot of noise, a lot of yelling, but look, they took the gun away and then he shot him. And it's like, okay, well, could a human being have reasonably perceived that a gun was taken away? That will require an investigation to determine, but it's like people expect ICE officers to have these robotic senses, but they are nonetheless human beings. They have human limits, excuse my laundry. They have human limits, so they can't just see where everything is at all times. They can't detect whether or not someone has a weapon. And if they have seen that someone has a weapon, they can't automatically detect whether that weapon has been taken away from them or not. And if they seize a weapon on someone and then a firearm goes off, it's maybe reasonable to assume that the person who they were trying to detain was the one who discharged that weapon. And maybe then it's reasonable to assume that you need to neutralize that threat. Otherwise, your life and the life of the officers around you is in danger. That would be what I would assume to be a reasonable human response, pending the investigation here. We have to wait for all of the evidence, but nobody wants to wait for the evidence. Everybody just wants to hold ICE officers to these impossible standards, and that is another instance in which people aren't thinking about incentives, because when you hold ICE officers or law enforcement officers in general to these impossible robotic standards, when they're constantly put in these high stakes, high stress, chaotic, violent situations, and you're going to expect them to act like a computer when they're human beings, nobody's going to join law enforcement if you do that. Because that's again an impossible standard to be held to. And who is going to risk having their entire life ruined if they dare make a human mistake? Why would anybody risk doing that? Nobody's going to join law enforcement. And that's why, part of the reason why you see nobody joining law enforcement in these blue cities where officers are held to those impossible standards. So you have to consider incentives whenever you're thinking about how you approach policy, how you think people should be treated in policy, because incentives are what drives people's behavior, and people's behavior shapes a society. So if you have bad incentive structures, you're going to end up with a bad society.